Hello, everyone. Welcome to e-flux this evening. It's a real. Hey, can I ask the folks in the back to, please? Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Filipa Cesar, a friend, filmmaker, artist from Berlin, who is with us after a kind of grueling session at the Flaherty seminar and her screening at MoMA earlier this week. And she will be doing a lecture, a kind of maybe lecture performance. No. Which is related to a really fascinating kind of a really fascinating side of Amilcar Cabral, which Filipa informed me was actually studied agronomy, right? And I think it was maybe a few years ago, around 2009 or something, Filipa discovered this collection of Cabral's writing on agronomy and became absolutely fascinated by it. And she's been working with this ever since. And it's a kind of a fascinating kind of strategic, political, poetic, kind of material, topological take on liberation and liberation practice. By way of introduction, Filipa Cesar is an artist and filmmaker interested in the fictional aspects of the documentary, the porous borders between cinema and its reception, and the politics and poetics inherent to the moving image. Since 2011, she has been looking into the origins of the cinema of the African liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau as a laboratory of resistance to ruling epistemologies. Cesar premiered her first feature-length essay film, Spell Reel, at the Forum section of the 67th Berlinale 2017. Let's give a warm welcome to Filipa Cesar.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Amal and Anton, for inviting me here. So I didn't test this yet, so I mean, the images I'm showing in the back is more like a kind of a compost of celluloid that will inform or be the base of the text I'm reading to you. That is called Humble Derives from Humus, a reading through Amilcar Cabral's Agro-Poetics of Liberation. First, people are the mountains. Mining historical strata to almost half a century ago, Amilcar Cabral is describing the state of the armed guerrilla struggle in the then known as Portuguese Guinea, one of Europeans' last colonial theaters of war, at the University of London on October 27, 1971. We are in a flat part of Africa. The manuals of guerrilla warfare generally state that mountains are the best place to develop guerrilla warfare. After 8 years of this anachronistic war that started in 1963, 2/3 of the small Western African country had been freed from Portuguese occupation. Schools, hospitals, courts, and people's communal shops have been established in the jungle, mangroves fields, and rural areas known as liberated zones. Cabral, the leader of the African Liberation Party, the PAIGC, moves between Conakry, where the struggle is being organized, and the world, where he propagates its struggle. Obviously, we don't have those conditions in Guinea, but this did not stop us being our armed liberated struggle. As for the mountains, we decided that our people had to take their place, so our peoples are our mountains. His audience, young Brits, migrants, students, leftist activists, and other supporters of the London-based Committee for Freedom of Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau in post-68 Commonwealth UK, get a first-hand account of an ongoing anti-colonial struggle. It's unlikely that this public could fathom that Cabral's image, mountains equal people, not only referred to the morphological flatness characterized the surface of that West African terrain, or even to the lack of hierarchical structures in the people's movements against colonial power, but rather an intimate relation Cabral maintained with the material matter of mountains, the soil. His image was a response to the strategic use of mountainous land as a resource of natural force by the Che Guevara guerrilla. Cabral had flattened that power within his special geopolitical circumstances, the people united from a single uniform that made no distance of rank, and by choosing education and humility as the preferred weapon of the militants. The mountain was the multitude made potent. Furthermore, even less metaphorical, this paternity, looking at masses of militants and seeing the force of mountains, is his understanding of a world in ecosophical terms. A lesser known and often neglected dimension of Amilcar Cabral is his agency as an agronomist and how his soil epistemology germinated his political formation. This text has been fermenting since 2009, when I first encountered the tome collecting Amilcar Cabral's agronomic studies, compiling 59 texts he produced between 48 and 60. This book influentially informed my further readings of Amilcar Cabral's speeches and political writings, more widely translated and published. In 1960, I was the only agronomist in my country. What a privilege. But now there are 12 agronomists in my country, all trained during the struggle. Cabral understood agronomy not merely as a discipline combining geology, soil science, agriculture, biology, and economy, but as a means to gain materialistic knowledge about people's lived conditions under colonialism. Data that would first become precious to a theoretical denunciation of the injustice of a land inscribed by colonial rule, and later informed the warfare itself. The operation of reading the people as mountains in the context of colonial extraction, oppression, and exploitation evidences a visionary understanding of the capitalocenic condition of edaphosphere. Edaphosphere is the surface of the earth. Meteorization of the rock. As a young student of agronomy, Amilcar Cabral carried out a research in Cuba, a flat and dry area in southern Portugal. In his 1949 bachelor dissertation called Erosion of Agricultural Soils, an investigation of Alentejo regions of Cuba, he described his economically poor and almost desertified land during Salazar's regime. This fieldwork introduces his distinct interest in concepts of soil and the phenomenon of erosion, their origins and their political historical readings. He studies Justus von Liebig, chemical definition. Soil is a laboratory in which to verify the most varied chemical reactions. Ferdinand von Richthofen, geological perspective. Soil is a pathological condition of the rock. And is most interested in Vasily Dukushev's definition, the soil is a natural, independent, and historical body. Cabral stresses the importance of not defining soil through its static morphological aspect, but through its variable, relational, and dynamic potential. The being from which the soil derives is the rock. Through natural and artificial action, the rock is fragmented, disintegrated, and forms what is called, in edaphology, original matter, the materialization of the rock. He refers to a relative negation of the rock, where natural agents destroy its structure and negate it, creating original matter. Subsequently, a second negation of the materialization corresponds to the development of the body soil, independent, natural, and historical. This balance is sustained through the contradiction generators of successive transformations, oxidations, reductions, carbonizations, dissolutions, hydrolyzes, volume variations, compost translocations, microorganic activities. Cabral elaborates on the coeval lithos and atmos forces, a zone of destruction and transformation between independent elements and from which life is possible, the crust of meteorization. The definition of meteorization of the rock as a negation of one in order to give rise to another informs a materialistic research to redefine soil within conflict zones. Cabral carefully noting the utility of embracing conflict and contradiction, negation and destruction, to think within the constituency of the stage where life occurs. Sorry for my English. The conflict between lithos and atmos is due to the antagonisms between rock and clima. If we admitted an existence of an intention in natural phenomena, we could argue that this opposition demands that the rock transforms itself in order to subsist. Neither the rock disappears completely, nor the climatic phenomena cease to operate. Rather, the rock gets integrated into a new form of negation existence. This observation, intention in natural phenomena, can be read as an urge to allow for a kind of rock agency, an intentionality or prosopomorphic drive of the rock soil as carrier of a prose, a narrative, the substrate where everything is inscribed. The intention of the natural phenomena reveals an animistic agency in this urge of subsistence models and of what follows, a subversive agency of Cabral within the field of institutional science on behalf of the oppression ruling power, the undercommons agency of geological work. Reading Cabral today, it is impossible not to see the urgency in his attempts at refusing metaphors and opting for language as operational linguistics, using science to do politics. The principle of agriculture is the beginning of the inscription of human existence on the soil. It is the beginning of history. The approach Cabral takes is reminiscent of historical materialistic operation Karl Marx carries out in Capital, but expanded into multi-perspective action. He resumes the definition of soil with an equation, where soil is the sum of all the properties of meteorization in a period of time. Palimpsest soil plus inscribed over time equals history. Third, colonial erosion. I have to wait for the image. After defining soil as a place of conflict, Amílcar Cabral continues with concepts of erosion. Operating under the constraints of the dictatorial Portugal, his agency should be read from an undercommons perspective, how to advance and inform a struggle from inside of the system and using this system to further it. And this is why it is important to reread these works of Cabral as having been carried out and shaped by the oppressive system utilizing censorship to enforce its power. The crisis of Portuguese agriculture led him to study Alentejo's edaphosphere, with a specific focus on its crisis, soil erosion. He chooses to examine the land of the oppressor and the conditions of its soil depletion as the result of Portugal's deterritorialized exploitation of other colonial soils. I mean, all the images are the quotes. The Alentejo panorama clearly reflects the influences of the historical process in the province. The maritime voyages of discovery resulted in the creation of an empire which led to the neglect of domestic agriculture, as the riches from India were more attracted than the uncertainty of laboring their own land. Soil is an inscribed body, and erosion, the scar left by historical violence. Cabral's scientific interest in Justus von Liebig, introduces another subtended political dimension. Although his references to Liebig solely address the chemistry of the rock, Cabral would also read Liebig's political position in the geo-economical discussions on soil. As Bellamy Foster suggests, when he wrote Capital, Marx had become convinced of the contradictory and unsustainable nature of capital agriculture due to two historical developments. First, the depletion of soil's fertility through the loss of soil nutrients was the overriding environmental concerns of capitalist society in both Europe and North America. And second, a shift in Liebig's own work in the late 1850s and early 1860s toward ecological critique of capitalist development. This European crisis in agriculture in the beginning of the 19th century and the ensuing search for alternative or external solutions such as the artificial fertilization also occurred in a global economical political period that culminated in the reconfiguration of colonial European-African relations, a post-industrial revolution, and an escalated post-slavery enterprise. While Cabral had read Liebig, Dokuchayev, Marx, and others, when he was later asked about his ideological sources at London University in 1971, he responded with, "Moving from the reality of one's own country towards the creation of an ideology of one's struggle doesn't imply that one has pretensions to be a Marx or a Lenin or any other great ideologist, but is simply a necessary part of the struggle." Cabral does not emulate the words of Liebig or even the theories of Marx, but operates similar gestures of cognizance assembled with situated knowledge. Strikingly, instead of studying the colonized African soil, his primary concern, Cabral opts to begin with the specificities of the oppressor's land, Portugal's own systemic crisis, and the metabolic propensity for violent solutions. Paradoxically, it is this work on Portuguese soil that gave Cabral the credentials for the colonial state to later engage him as an agronomist in the overseas province. The colonialists have the habit of telling us that when they arrive in Africa, they put us into history. You are well aware that there's the contrary. When they arrived, they took us out of history. This echoed what later William Flusser pointed out with the true planters are legionaries, as the colonial powers still knew in the 19th century, for colonization was synonymous with cultivation and planters with legionaries. Clearly arguing with a scientific discourse, Amilcar Cabral is also operating a scientific language of working within the system. Quote, it has to come. "The voyages of discovery gave new worlds to the world, and the agriculture they brought developed in new lands, cutting forests, turning forests to desert, and destroying nature meadows. Erosion devastates entire regions, indifferent to an exclusive technique considered omnipotent. In the Americas, Africa, and Australia, examples abound." In 1952, Cabral is employed by the Overseas Ministry to engage in a one-year study on the farming practice in the occupied Guinea, the land of his birth. Although this could be understood as a submission to colonial power, the subversive nature of a submission, a mission under, of official agency is understated. 2 years later, Cabral published a series of agronomic articles, including In Defense of the Earth, 1 to 5, and On the Use of the Earth of Black Africa. In the latter, he centers on the principal human components of agriculture and its economies. The fundamental source and determining aspect are the human social beings themselves, whose actions are dependent upon the economic structure sustained by agricultural activities. He goes on to address the violence of the imposed soil politics and their situated contradictions. Quote, "The cultural system redolent of Black Africa is an itinerant system. A portion of jungle or savanna is chosen for cultivation, the natural vegetation is thinned and then burned. The earth is exploited for a short period of time and then abandoned. The forest or the savanna then reclaims the land. The itinerant system, nomadic agriculture, demands a high level of settlement instability. The people don't attach themselves to the land." Cabral explains how the itinerant agricultural system is an endemic solution to the problems imposed by Black African environment and becomes very acute in his criticism of colonial agriculture measures. Another quote. "In short, colonialism has introduced a new system of production into Africa, which translates as économie du traite, trade economy. However, it maintains the nomadic system of cultivation of the land, without taking into account the specificities of the mesologic condition. This differs from European agriculture practices, but Europe is convinced of the superiority of its own practices." Cabral argues with the scientific discourse what Frantz Fanon in 1968 stringently theorizes. A quote by Fanon. Facing this world, the European nation wallow in the most ostentatious opulence. This European opulence is literally scandalous, for it has been founded on slavery. It has been nourished with the blood of slaves, and it comes directly from the soil and from the subsoil of the underdeveloped world. Carefully collating scientific data to construct a logical argument, Cabral denounces the exploitative effects of the extractionist system of the économie de traite, adding to what Liebig describes as a situation created as soon as the empirical agriculture of the trader becomes a spoliation system. The conditions of reproduction of the soil are undermined. Every system of farming based on spoliation of the land leads to poverty. At the same time, Cabral admits that itinerant agriculture does not allow for a certain cultural and infrastructural development because of its rootlessness, but goes on with a factual progress-oriented position. The evolution of new African cultural technologies in the sense of better serving the progress of Black African people cannot ignore the fact that they have a profound knowledge about the environment and its possibilities. The fact that this vital need is neglected has already led to several catastrophes. At the heart of this can generally be found a complex mesh of components introduced into the life of Black Africa by a new entity, colonialism. So during Salazar's and Marcelo's regime in Portugal, in colonial Portugal, Portugal was characterized by a dusty dictatorship sustained by a sweeping, creeping censorship and the rhetorical construction of fantasies about powerful empire. In reality, the country was deeply backwards. The illiteracy rate of population was close to 50% in 1952. Within this context, Cabral initially avoids overt politics and diligently develops generous, generative, and constructive alternatives to the colonial system. One of his last official acts as a state agronomist is to propose sugar beet plantations in Portugal, offering, given the increase of European demand and consumption of sugar, a profitable nation option to overcome the exploitation of sugar cane in its tropical overseas territories. Cabral is reversing the mirror back onto Europe to reflect on the same global agricultural crisis previously addressed by Liebig and Marx. Economic factors in Europe were one of the causes behind the European settlement in Africa after the Age of Discoveries. With a simple trade in goods, including enslaved black men, Europeans spent the rewards of exploitation of the land, but like black Africans, the aim was to produce essential goods. European cultivated or forced black Africans to cultivate farm products. The 19th century European agriculture crisis escalated the conditions that led to an upgrade of the Scramble for Africa through the algorithm of the Berlin Conference in 84-85. Cabral expands Liebig's critique of the spoliation of the European agricultural system, resulting in European depletion of its own soil, and Marx's historical environmental materialistic theory from a counter-colonial inverted perspective that bolsters his situated knowledge. From the contradiction created, African land is being devastated day by day, in a life that is out of balance, obliged to satisfy not only the new demands created by the requirements of a new social condition, he, the African subject, slowly uproots himself, migrates or is forced to migrate. He abandons the land or doesn't have the time to assimilate the knowledge that he has created and accumulated over centuries based on the transmission of empirical knowledge about the environment. The lack of balance in the management of black African soil encourages the emergence of diseases that debilitate the human organism. The situated African perspective is present in what recently Denise Ferreira da Silva revisions to Marx wages, labor, surplus equation that ignored safe labor. In the modern Western imagination, blackness has no value. It is nothing. Or by what Murkuje proposed to understand, colonialisms or imperialisms, old and anew, as a state of permanent war on the global environment. Although working with the tools of glassy Western sciences, Amilcar Cabral stays with the soil, original matter, and with the African subject, entangling the implications of violated soil on human beings, the imposed knowledge that violently obliterates other knowledges that Cabral, as a seer, projects into the present, the forced migration of African subjects until today, as a result of historical debilitation of the soil body and consequently the human organism. Four, underground double agency. I got myself a contract as an agronomist and went to Angola, taking the opportunity to gather comrades to discuss with them the new path we should follow in the struggle for our lands, under the control of the PID, the political police comrades. The subversive double agency of Cabral becomes evidence when viewing, side by side, his current curriculum as a political activist and as an agronomist between 1948 and 1960. Articles like On the Use of the Earth in Black Africa made it difficult for Cabral to operate in colonized Guinea. This didn't hinder him from acquiring other duties as an agronomist on behalf of Portugal, which points to the ineptitude of the Portuguese state police. In 1955, Cabral founded the MINC, the National Independence Movement in Guinea, and transferred his agronomic work to Angola, Cape Verde, and Lisbon. Then in 1956, he co-founded the MPLA in Angola, the PAGC in Guinea-Bissau, and in Lisbon, the Movement for the Liberation of People of the Portuguese Colonies. To reread Cabral is not to nostalgically praise an articulated construction of anti-colonial struggle. To reread Cabral is to learn how he came to realize the notion of to serve on any ground fighting the same enemy. Sorry for the timing. To operate a struggle materialistically and aesthetically through the channel of the undercommons. Looking back to 1948, when he was starting his dialogue with soil and the conflict with lithos and atmos, Cabral had just joined the House of the Students from the Empire in Lisbon. This academic institution, operating between 1944 and 1965, had been created by the Overseas Ministry itself to propagate a sense of global Portugality among the students from the colonies. Here, he communed with Eduardo Mondlane, that became the founder of Frelimo, Mário Pinto Andrade, later MPLA, and the partner of the pioneer, the filmmaker Sara Maldoror, and Agostinho Neto, later MPLA, and many other future resistant leaders. The students of this institution quickly subverted the official agenda of the House and backfired to become a hotspot for the young intellectuals to develop a critical discourse about colonial politics and later to prepare the armed struggle. The House published numerous short poetry publications and edited a magazine called Message, that focused on non-European Lusophone poetry. The cultural disguise of these becoming politicized young poets used poetry as an encrypted language, not only by addressing the burdened imaginary of the oppressed African and Asian subjects within the poetic channel only accessible for those sharing the code, but the fact that the code was embedded and embodied by an empathic inheritance with what was transmitted. So technically, the Portuguese political police, in the various raids on the House and surveillance reports of the students' cultural activities, had a lot of difficulties of decoding the poetic musings of an inconspicuous political organization that was smothering inside colonial academia. The young Cabral and his kindred academics were already practicing the undercommons as designed by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. And I quote them: "The university needs what she bears, but cannot bear what she brings. And on top of all that, she disappears. She disappears into the underground, the down low, low down maroon community of the university, into the undercommons of enlightenment, where the work gets done, where the work gets subverted, where the revolution is still black, still strong." Meanwhile, Cabral continued his studies in agronomy, now directing it to the phytosanitary conditions of food storage, as seen in his work in Angola, Cape Verde, and Lisbon, and was able to move freely between these places as he gained first-hand data about the dependency of the Portuguese economy on the overseas products, the trade economy, and projecting these potential questions between food storage and archival drive. I'm quoting Cabral again. Oh no, sorry. I'm quoting Fred Moten. "To enter this space, the undercommons, is to inhabit the ruptural and enraptured disclosure of the commons, that fugitive enlightenment enacts, the criminal, matricidal, queer in the cistern, on the stroll of the stolen life, the life stolen by enlightenment and stolen back. In later political speeches, Cabral would apply his research to his argument. Economic strength means also to destroy and to build. We know that in our land, exploitation has mainly operated through the almost forced pursuage of agricultural products from our people in Guinea, at prices set by the state colonialist traders. We have analyzed the cultivation of peanuts in depth, and we have reached the conclusion that it was forced labor. Then, in August 1959, sailors and merchants demonstrated for a better working condition at the Pijiquiti port in Bissau. This turned into a massacre with 50 people killed and hundreds wounded. This halted all attempts at a peaceful negotiation to end colonial Portuguese occupation. Half a year later, in 1960s, Cabral gave up his job as an agronomist and went underground, leaving Portugal forever to become a full-time political strategist and a theorist of the liberation movement. The following spring, in 1961, hundreds of students from African colonies secretly fled from Portugal, like here in this image, this is the escape, and the forced recruitment of colonial military to fight on the other side of the same war. The House of the Students from the Empire functioned as the main organizational hub for the escape operation. In 1963, marks the start of the armed struggle in Guinea. 5. Semantics of soil for a liberation epistemology. Cabral emerged from his double agency, the agronomist working for Portugal and the philosopher of the anti-colonial resistance under the alias Abel Jassy, to become a full-time guerrilla theorist. His speeches to the general population, the UN, the guerrilla fighters, the guerrilla teachers, are embedded with another process, the decolonization of the language itself. Creole, in particular, is a language that derives from an appropriation of Portuguese and the assimilation of oral and ethnic languages, and the language Cabral made common to 32 ethnic groups during the struggle. A particular poetic and advanced aspect of Guinean Creole is its metonymical character. For example, the Creole word for human being is sinner. Entering a semantic dimension of this particular language becomes an operation of the colonization itself. Creole is the humus fermenting, the very unnoticed, unstudied, and neglected inscription of 500 years of resistance. Creole is the subliminal transmission of continuous and ceaseless urge for emancipation. No rivers. In Guinea, land is cut by arms of the sea that we call rivers. This is also a quote by Cabral. But in depth, they are not rivers. Buba, that is no river at all, because until we arrive to dry land, there is only salty water. I lost myself. I lost my quote. Okay, it's here, super. So Guinean's morphology is a mountainous alluvium, with 70% of its soil under sea level. These arms of the sea have no word in the colonial lexicon. They propose the coeval ocean and soil in another contradictional tidal conflict. The awareness of this lack of definition signals something amiss in the colonial epistemology. You only see what you already know. the ignorance of the alluvium. Centrifugal movement. We adopted a strategy that we might call centrifugal. We started in the center and moved towards the periphery of our country. This came as the big surprise of the Portuguese, who had stationed their troops on the Guinea and Senegal borders on the supposition that we were going to invade our own country. This demonstrates how to not attack or invade our own land is particular to how effective tactics results from a coherence and a legitimacy of a situated mindset. This accounts for both the agency and the knowledge producer and that of the object of study. Cabral proves the ignorance of the colonial military forces in their miscalculation of whether the rebels, the terrorists, would attack from their tactics, and the error of all colonial construction of occupation. This is in agreement with the idea that the guerrilla are not military. The guerrilla are armed militants, and that they are ought to drop their weapons as soon as the land is liberated. Logically, oppressed people whose land is occupied by Portuguese are unlikely to attack their own land from outside. The struggle begins in the center of the land because it is a people's struggle and then moves in a centrifugal manner like a kind of expanded version of a geometric form of revolution. Declension of fear. And now we need sound. This is Cabral's voice.
No exército, com o trabalho político que tem libertado uma terra. A maior libertação na terra que nós devemos fazer é acabar com a ignorância na terra. Só uma hora que homens como Deus na terra entendem aquela vez, que por medo, que por perder medo. Medo de rio que enche demais, que não for quente. Medo de trovoada, medo de relâmpago, medo de raio, medo de polão, medo de caminho escuro, medo de mato de cobiana, medo de mato de quimera, medo de moro, medo de pesqueiro, medo de jambacoque, medo de cipaio ou polícia, medo de qualquer dirigente político, medo de qualquer homem que pode ter arma na mão, medo de qualquer força que está assediando. Só uma hora que o homem entende claro que pode ter aquele medo. Mas você vê nosso povo, né, vivendo medo, tinha demais, tinha tempo de medo. A maior libertação que nós podemos fazer na terra é libertar nosso povo de medo. Para libertar nosso povo de medo, tem que libertar de ignorância. Esse é fundamental, camarada. Por isso que trabalho de professor é trabalho de frente na luta, de vanguarda.
In 1967, Cabral addresses an assembly of guerrilla teachers in the liberation zones in Bué. Here, another dimension of language appears. The word fear, the most feared of all, is put into a mantra of declension. Fear and its instrumentalization is the true enemy, not the Portuguese, and it can only be exercised through education. This wrapping of the word and the analogous agents of its production are spoken out, while the rhythm declension of the word causes its erosion. The literal sense of the declension of the word, fear, and its agents get bent and stop moving downwards. The alluvium gently declines towards the sea. National animism. Another quote. Even the Cubiana bush, we have been inhabiting it safely, especially since the Iran, the sacred entity in animistic religions of Guinea-Bissau, is as well a nationalist. He said, the Iran, clearly, that the Tugas, the Portuguese colonialists, have to go away, that they have nothing to do in our land. Spell NATO. Cabral's prisms is refracted by shrapnel, a soil composed of scrap weaponry. The word under scrutiny now is NATO. In his 1965 speech in Dar es Salaam, when NATO stops being an acronym to become a concrete matter, exploded bombs and mines, artillery, and technology of warfare. Cabral doesn't care about the acronym. He focuses on the archaeological site that is the soil of Guinea-Bissau. With his rhetorical gesture, Cabral refuses to accept the abstraction of the initials of a Western deal. He addresses the core of all wars, the weapon industry, and its lobbies. NATO, is a quote, NATO is the US. We have captured in our country many US weapons. NATO is the Federal Republic of Germany. We have a lot of Mauser rifles taken from the Portuguese soldiers. NATO, for the time being at least, is France. In our country, there are Alouette helicopters. NATO is, etc. Once again, the organism that is soil speaks, and its original matter is not only rock, but also the components, shrapnel from the battlefield. The unilateral declaration of independence. Amílcar Cabral was assassinated on the 20th of January 1973. He was not present to attend the event. He slowly, carefully seeded and germinated. In the hills of Boé, the only elevated area of this flat and flooded country, the leaders of the PAJC reunited its militants in the first popular assembly. A bureaucratic ritual in the midst of the jungle declared the Republic of Guinea independent. Cabral knew that such acts cast spells on the geopolitical warfare. A country that declares its own independency changes the meaning of the signifier intrinsic to an armed conflict. For a colonial war in Portuguese overseas province, with the local rebels uprising to an armed struggle to liberate an independent nation from Portuguese occupation. Six, to matter matters. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what knowledge know knowledges. It matters what relations relate relations. It matters what worlds worlds. Donna Haraway. Amílcar Cabral insisted on the need to return to the source. But this shouldn't be confused with the return to an origin, or a root that could be linked to an essentializing claim of radicality, but to return to original matter. Cabral departs from specificities of a land and the conditions of people's life and in it. This position partially fills in the void left by the Eurocentric Marxist critique and demands a return to the rock, to the Edafos conflict sphere, refusing the to reify the definitions enforced by the blind spot of colonial tesauros. This proposition, to return to the matter of the ground, also implies going underground, both in the sense of the subversive meaning of mining through the system from which one operates, and the material meaning of being within the humus and inhabiting its metabolic processes. This crust of meteorization reclaims its own epistemology that follows a cognitive humility. Humble derives from humus, that is not compatible with a particular ruling system. Humility is not a submissive mindset. It is also not a religious abdication of individualist forces or desires. It doesn't mean a submission to power, but rather a submission, a mission under, a creepy agency linked to the multitudinous soil phenomena. The useful contradictions of humans as an antithesis of nature within nature itself is latent in Cabral's writings, anticipating what William Flusser later described as a human being waits for nature because he himself is not in it. To set traps, that is, to exist, he must categorize, that is, exist, existere, to make stand out of nature. And outside of nature is the gesture of planting seeds and also planting mines, the digging of holes to place detonable explosives. The Guinean guerrilla war, the war of seeding traps, where mines sojourn in wait of the occupier. The contradictory gesture of undermining lies within the process of contaminating one's own soil. The riches of a land in the midst of a struggle become a poison resource, impossible to exploit, a mined soil, an opaque science. The digging of holes to turn the unpredictable into the inevitable. Only an understanding of Cabral's stratified operations makes sense of his strategy of conducting a slow war. A slow war fertilizes the terrain for Harney and Motton's undercommons, where the commons give refuge, where the refuge gives commons. Slow war, apparently a paradox, and like his fellow Angolan fighters, accelerated militarization in 1966, Cabral refuses Fidel Castro's offering of foreign forces and instead opts for education and medical care with support of Cuba, Soviet Union, Romania, Sweden, and Yugoslavia. Cabral envisioned a slow move of People Mountains towards the recapture of the occupied territories, occupied language, and occupied bodies, while simultaneously germinating the infrastructure of a future independent society behind the front line in the liberated zones. A guerrilla war waged centrifugally from inside to outside, circling towards a utopian society, a vindication of a ecosophical force. Cabral elaborated on the definition of technologies of soil, of reading soil, not only expanding original matter from rock to shrapnel, but also anticipating what James Moore coined as the capital scene. As a transcendental historical materialist, Cabral not only envisaged a capitalistic understanding of the edaphosphere, but translated that into action. The weapon of theory, or our people are our mountains, are not metaphors in the least, rather words cast as deeds. So the original matter is no longer rock, but also shrapnel and gunpowder, building a soil library for geomancy. Stones and pebbles composing into a theory, traversing Marx's metabolic rift, Liebig's critique of capitalist agriculture, anticipating Flusser's perverse gesture of planting and Guattari's ecosophical claim. All of this grounded in the contention that European riches and accumulated capital came at the expenses of colonial subjects and the exhausted soil. This historical blind spot was pointed at by Denise Ferreira da Silva. For blackness refers to matter as the thing. It refers to that without form. It functions as a nullification of the all signifying order that sustains value in both its economic and ethical sins. And well synthesized in Jennifer Wenzel equation, inverting the deficit of neo-colonial accounting, where Africa will have paid at least 4 times for the development of the first world. Once in human capital through the slave trade, again in natural capital in the extraction of resources during high imperialism and after, and again in financial capital and the social cost of structural adjustment through debt serving in the area of development of neoliberalism. And finally, in the disproportionate effects in Africa of climate change that is largely caused by carbon emissions elsewhere. After Cabral's death, the later turn to neocolonialism in Guinea-Bissau, nudged along by individual desires, tripped by the course of a state once envisioned, through the struggle, despite the diligence of Cabralist enchantment to blind away the tragic contradictions embedded within the national model Cabral proposed for Guinea, means to overlook the analogous violence of the colonial national pattern, homogenizing dozens of ethnic groups into one single Guinean people, reaffirming the borders drawn by the bloody blades in Berlin 84-85. At the same time, contradiction and self-criticism were essential for Cabral, as he clearly stated in the opening of his contribution to the First Tricontinental Conference in Havana, 1966. We note, however, that one form of struggle which we consider to be fundamental has not been explicitly mentioned in this program. We refer here to the struggle against our own weaknesses. And I finish. To simultaneously reread Cabral's different texts means to return him to the rhizosphere of transversal ongoing struggle and animate ongoing global discussions to defunct a colonial worlding cartography. But to do so requires the application of his unearthed lexicon, with humility, with dirty words made of humus and mud, to verb matter, to superate. Our people are our mountains is a tool operating a coeval organisms. People, mountains, fused by the meteorization and negation existences. The negation of the rock to give rise to the soil, the negation of the soil to give rise to life, the negation of life to give rise to riches, the negation of riches to give rise to uprisings. The mountain is at war. Armed struggle is not a stage upon which to kill, but a state of exception to encircle and expand another type of a cognitive mode and an awareness of a permanent mesological state of war. Neither his brilliant agronomic studies, nor his perseverance in warfare, nor his poetic turns of speech, nor Cabral's subversive and empathic social skills is his most valuable contribution to de-worlding. It is rather all of this combined to create a rare militant enchantment to mobilize mountains. People are the mountains is a capitalocenic mindset, an early post-historical vision of the soil, a negation of coloniality through means of its own contradiction. All of the pages of of all the books and all the world's libraries, are not its whole memory, but whether all of the memory of the soil is the never-to-accomplish encyclopedia. The inscription on the palimpsest soil tells the narrative of the wretchedness of its humus. It matters what matters, matters. And now I'm going to demystify these images because you want to know where they come from. And we are going to hear. I like compost images. I like images in compost to give the base of the text. I didn't make a test of the timing, so it's like. It will come.
Boa noite a todo mundo ali. Vou desculpar, vou escutar um bocadinho, meninadas. Por favor, nós devemos começar a atividade.
Esse estudante de Guiné-Bissau que está na Cuba na 67. Veja se mandar de Conakry para Cuba, 25 estudantes. Aquela é Flora Gomes. Não estava fazendo trabalho produtivo fim de semana. Coisa simbólico. Aquela é Chucha Mendes, já de Chicoté. Aquela Arlino, anestesista, que está lá no fundo, camisa risco. É anestesista, está na Canchongo Goss. A nossa era, portanto, o primeiro contingente de 25 estudantes, depois vem mais outros que vêm para o hospital. Ele que é bem reforçado, mas nas 72, 71 chega mais outro contingente, mais novo ainda. Aquela Aurélia, é laboratorista. Parece muro, gosto. Aquela é aquela fina crata, não colega, e era nós quatro que vai estudar cinema. Fina é um dele, ela era a única mulher na metade. Aquela Teresa Cabral, ela que era não responsável, ela que Afonso Manuel Latna. Só você trabalho voluntário e simbólico, não. E simplesmente para se a gente um bocado de humildade, para que pensa como um diploma está apoiando lá na seu. É o homem que não faz foto, ele é no treinador de câmara de cinema, Derives.
One of the 4 filmmakers that did these images that we saw in the back, Sana Nahara. Yeah, and thank you so much. Is there a Q&A or something? I don't know. I don't know if there is questions. Or if you want to. Sorry, I didn't test this, so it was a bit kamikaze. But it's based on the text that I wrote. Is there any question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the footage that you used. Was it mainly from these filmmakers, but it was also treated a bit, the composted footage.
Yeah, I mean the images they're like from 3 moments, I think. First is really the jungle war in Guinea-Bissau. And then I think there is one part that is in Cape Verde where people are actually demonstrating, and like is the day where the independence of Cape Verde is declared, and so that actually it was 2 related countries, no? So Guinea-Bissau is on the West African coast, and Cape Verde is this archipelago of islands in front. So, and these are like the festivities of the liberation. And later is images that the filmmakers did on the shrapnel, the rest of what the Portuguese military left behind, but really like after 6 years, so the nature was already taking this footage, these weapons, like, so they were there since 6 years. So they shot those images in 1980 or 1979, 1980. Yeah, but of course the images come from actually a long project I did with the 2 still living filmmakers, Sananada and Flora Gomes, together with the arsenal of like digitizing what was the remains of this archive. I mean, the footage that they were shooting during the war, after the war, until 1980, where there's a kind of neo-colonial coup d'etat that stops this kind of militant film production. So there's a parallel between like the stop of a certain philosophy for this country, like a socialist idea, and inspired by Marx and everything, and then, you know, like the end of it in 1980s coup d'etat. So. This is the book, so if someone wants to have a look.
Yes, I just have a question.
All in Portuguese.
Under what circumstances was Cabral killed? I mean, was like CIA probably involved, right? Because they had like an anti-colonial, I mean, anti-revolutionary program, right, in Africa. And there were a lot of leaders were killed. Patrice Lumumba was killed in Congo. But now, there's a lot of documents come out that like sort of implicate CIA covert operations and death of a lot of those leaders.
I have to come to the archives here because it's still a mystery. Of course, there's all kinds of theories that the Portuguese killed him, or there's also the theory that is CIA theory that is like Sékou Touré because he wanted the big Guinea. So it's all kind of. I mean, it's not revealed until today. So it's true. Actually, it's a time now to look at the documents that might give some light to that, but it wasn't done yet. I mean, I don't know, because this is 74 till now is still not. You know, I don't know if I think 50 years or 60 years of classified documents. I don't know when it.
Freedom of information. Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe.
Soon, maybe we'll have some idea. It will be revealed, but not that I know yet.
Sure. Thanks.
I mean, for sure, also from the Portuguese government, but as I mean, I tried to look at the archives actually, like a long time ago, 5 years ago, and there was no information. Yeah, it was classified when it happened, and then I think all the documents, for example, Portugal had a dictatorship until 74. They are now starting to reveal the P documents and everything, but still today there's no clear. I mean, there was some attempts there were some books written like trying to bring the light to it, but it's not yet. There's not a one theory. There's many theories, because he was actually, I mean, physically he was killed by his own bodyguards, but the bodyguards were former prisoners of the Portuguese government. So you don't know. Okay, that's it.
Can you talk more about the video itself and your, kind of this dialogue with it? Because it was presented as a performance.
No, I mean, I say the reading. It's just a reading.
Oh, okay.
I just, yeah.
Is it supposed to be kind of read along with this video, this abstracted experimental piece? Is it like in dialogue with your lecture, or?
Yeah, I mean, the only dialogue that I wanted to establish, because the archive project was developed in parallel while I was actually also reading this book, and I thought there was a connection, actually something that I have it in another text, but I didn't. I wanted to focus on the soil issue, but I wanted to connect as well, like maybe more empathically, without defining it so much, this relation between a kind of an inscription on the celluloid film and the composition of the celluloid film as also some kind of process, like a composed process as well, because it's also decomposing. There's another layers that go on top of it. It's kind of inscription of like the violence these images went through. Like that can be like a reflection also of the violence of this country, or also the climate dimensions of the different, like celluloid film was not invented in tropical countries as originally, like there's also a really a climate issue about archiving this material, because they are in permanently humidity conditions and like heat, and it's very difficult to archive this material there. So I thought it was interesting that this is also like a material conflict between what Cabral was also saying about like a land that needs a kind of instability of like a nomad kind of occupation in order to regenerate itself and reclaim the soil, like itself. So because it's how it functions, and the way colonial agricultural was bringing other techniques and destroying it. So I was trying to just not defining it so much, just having it there as because maybe it was disturbing, but I mean. Of course, the idea was not, with my lousy English that you understand every word of what I said, but also more to create a kind of a space where maybe you understood one or two sentences, and also the noise of these images that actually can bring maybe a more sensorial idea to what I'm actually reading. So that was a little bit. I don't know if it functioned. I never tried it before. I also didn't make. A rehearsal at home, so it was an experiment.
I thought it was really effective. I thought it was really effective. Yeah.
Thank you. I haven't seen it yet, so.
You mentioned Cuba. Cuba, the country.
I mentioned two types of Cuba.
Right.
So there's a Portuguese Cuba, and there's an old mythology about that that's very crazy, and there's also the Cuba, and of course in the Caribbean.
Conference.
Yeah.
I wanted to know whether Cabral went there.
Yes, so he was there in 1966, and that was the interesting issue, because he met with Fidel Castro, and Castro asked, "Okay, we want to help your struggle. What can we do?" And he of course offered support to any colonized countries in Africa, and for example Fidel Castro sent a lot of forces to Angola. Also, Che Guevara himself went there to help the struggle. But Cabral had already this idea, what I think is fascinating, this idea like, I can't have foreign troops in my country, so otherwise there will be a problem on the end. As soon as, so I want the people to organize themselves, liberate it, and then when, so this idea also already, the problem of having foreign troops during a war was something that we are like living today all the time. So it's very interesting that he said, no, I want more this situation. I want you to educate my people. So he sent students to Cuba to be educated, and he only asked for medical care and but not forces, not soldiers. So it was
working or doing this performance, at least that was the man's interpretation of what they were doing, through working the land. Was that happening in which Cuba? The Portuguese or?
Sorry again?
So in those images, so what's up there? Where are they?
They are in Cuba. They are in Cuba. They are making voluntary work.
Right, but in which Cuba?
Cuba,
the country?
Havana, Cuba.
Havana, Cuba, okay.
So basically, what I thought it was very interesting because Sana was saying, okay, we are doing actually both like an exercise of cinema because we are with our teacher of cinematography is there, Derives Spinoza. He's there helping us, and we are at the same time doing voluntary work, and he also said that this kind of voluntary work sometimes was symbolic, just to learn this experience of the common, this experience of he says really learning how to be humble, So this was it was very interesting in terms of like an education proposal. Yeah.
I was wondering if the idea of the fictional in documentaries play into like your work here at all.
The idea of
like the fictional of documentaries that was mentioned in your in the intro they just read out. Like if that idea.
Yeah,
plays
I
in.
just don't make. When it's written, actually it comes from a text someone wrote, but. Because I think the fictional aspect of documentary is I don't see there is this big difference, between documentary and fiction. At least I think documentary is also very fictional, and so it's more a contradictory sentence. I think that it's not too. Yeah, it's just that I don't think there is a big. Once you put a camera somewhere, there's things happening that are addressed or they're shaped for that as well, and yeah, I think only the editing is already a fiction, So those, this was a long issue, but yeah. So thank you so much. We can talk having a drink.